Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Weiler, and I'm a professor emeritus at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. And I'm co-director of the Anti-Corruption Law Program with my friend and colleague, John Ritchie. My job is to welcome you to now our third monthly webinar in 2021 of the program. The Anti-Corruption Law Program is a joint working partnership of the Center for Business Law at the Allard School of Law at UBC, Transparency International Canada chapter, and I have the privilege of serving as vice chair of TI Canada, and the International Center for Criminal Law Reform and Criminal Justice, which has its office at UBC as well. So this is the 23rd session of the Anti-Corruption Law Program over a period of 4 years. The program really is happened because these three organizations, all of whom are doing valuable work in the field of anti-corruption, decided to engage in their own form of collective action to engage in capacity building through continuing public education, and where we bring together experts in the field of anti-corruption, like our panel today, and like the registrants today. I'm so pleased there's over 80 registrants this morning, but where we teach each other, about the best ways to fight corruption. So special thanks to Dr. Carol Liao, who's the director of the Center for Business Law at UBC, and Charles Lee, who's the associate director. Through their help and support, particularly the expert technical support, we're able to do these webinars, and so we can attract not only expert panelists, but registrants from anywhere who want to join us in this sort of mutual learning exercise. I just want to thank in advance our distinguished panel, which of course is the major draw for the fact we've got so many registrants this morning. Nicholas Barclay from the European Investment Bank, and I know, Nicholas, we're cutting into your supper time in Europe where you're based. Pascal Dubois, who's in Washington, DC, so we're cutting into Pascal's lunch hour. But I'd like to say welcome back to Pascal, who was a keynote speaker in a session where we were discussing the work of the Integrity Vice President, presidency of the World Bank back in June of 2019, I guess it was. And so it's nice to have Pascal back with us. And a special welcome today to Frédéric Duguay from the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So my job really is to just warm up things and turn it over to my colleague, Susan Cote-Freeman, who will moderate our panel today. And Susan also, along with John, they were the ones that really organized the session today. Susan is currently the chair and president of Transparency International Canada chapter, after having spent a couple of decades actually working for Transparency International Secretariat through their offices in London, Washington, and head office in Berlin, where Susan was the head of the Business Integrity Program of TI Global, and working closely with the World Economic Forum, the United Nations Global Compact, and the B20, before returning to Canada, where for a number of years she worked for the Conference Board of Canada. She's been a member of the board of directors of TI Canada since 2016, and is now the very able president and chair of our organization. A real pleasure to work with. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Susan to get today's session going. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's really my pleasure to moderate the panel today, and I really look forward to our discussion. But before I do anything else, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Ottawa on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. Just a couple of words on the genesis of this theme today. As you all know, the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a new institution. It was created in 2017, and it's really trying to sort of build its infrastructure for integrity, no pun intended there. We thought it would be interesting to get to know the Canada Infrastructure Bank and to sort of better understand how it's putting together its ethical framework, as it is really starting from the very beginning. And we all know that infrastructure is a highly how shall I say, an area that's highly susceptible to corruption. It will be really interesting to gain some understanding of the integrity measures that the bank is putting in place. We're also going to hear, as Joe said, from a much more established organization, the European Investment Bank. The EIB was established in 1958, and it is the world's largest public lending institution. So there's a lot of mature systems there, a very large organization active throughout the world. So it should be very interesting to hear how their integrity system operates. And finally, we're going to hear from Pascal, who is an international expert, who's going to give us a bit of a bird's eye view on the topic today and speak to us from the perspective of her long experience in the anti-corruption field, and also as an enforcer in her the role she played at the World Bank. Now, before I introduce our speakers a little more thoroughly, I just wanted to say that this event, just to remind you, this event is held in webinar format. And we encourage you to actually ask questions to the panelists and do it throughout the session. You don't have to wait till the end. We'll have presentations and then a Q&A. But if you send your questions as we go along through the Q&A function, I will monitor those, and we can ask, we can make this a little more interactive. The chat function is also open. You can use it as well. Just remember to be polite, but the questions I would prefer to monitor the Q&A if possible. So let me introduce our participant. So the first speaker today will be Frédéric Duguay. He is the General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at the CIB. And I note that he is the CIB's first General Counsel, and he took the post in November 2018. Frédéric is a lawyer by training, and in his capacity at the CIB, he's responsible for leading the legal affairs, the corporate secretariat, as well as the compliance functions and regulatory activities of the CIB. And this includes the implementation of governance structures for investment transactions and responses to access to information requests. Nick Barkley has a background in finance. He joined the EIB in 1999, and he worked in the bank's lending operations. He was advisor to the EIB president. He worked in human resources and corporate services before becoming director of regulation and group risk in 2017. And he was appointed deputy director general, head of compliance in January 2020. Our third speaker, Pascal Hélène Dubois, who's also somebody I've known for many, many years in the anti-corruption arena, and I hope I consider her a friend, and I hope it's the same for her. Pascal is also a lawyer by training. She retired from the World Bank Group in 2020, and when she retired, she was the VP of the Integrity Vice Presidency, INT, leading the World Bank Group's investigative efforts and the pursuit of sanctions in connection with allegations of fraud and corruption on a World Bank finance project. She also served as the World Bank's first ever chief suspension and debarment officer. And prior to that, she managed the groundbreaking voluntary disclosure program in the INT. Pascal has a long list of credentials, but I will also mention that she is a certified fraud examiner and has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center since 2009, where she teaches a course on international anti-corruption. So those are the bios, the short bios of our very stellar speakers today. They will each speak for 10 to 15 minutes. And as I said, send in your questions if you have something specific about what a speaker is saying, and we'll try to follow up immediately after, and then we can go to a more general discussion after they've all spoken. So I'm going to hand over the mic to Frédéric Duguay for him to make his presentation. So Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Susan. Good morning and good afternoon. And I can see that the PowerPoint presentation is up. So really what I hope to achieve today is to, one, give you an introduction and an overview of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. As Susan mentioned, we are a new entity. And as part of that, as part of my role in respect of legal and compliance more generally, give you an overview of the progress that we've made in terms of starting from a blank sheet of paper and the processes that we've put in place to meet best practices overall in terms of integrity matters and in terms of anti-corruption. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Canada Infrastructure Bank. Who are we? Well, we are a federal crown corporation that was established in June of 2017 by a federal statute. Our purpose is to invest and to seek to attract investment from private sector investors and institutional investors into infrastructure projects that are located in Canada or partly in Canada, and that are in the public interest. We were established as, let's say, one of the tool from the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan of 2016 that provided federal funding for over $180 billion of infrastructure investments. Within that 180 billion, given that most of the infrastructure projects in Canada is still primarily funded through government contributions from the federal government down to the provinces, down to the municipalities for their infrastructure priorities, and this is still the case. But the idea of the bank was to try to stimulate more private sector involvement into infrastructure projects and to transfer more risk, particularly in terms of operational risks and revenue risks, into infrastructure projects that would be revenue generating. So as part of that, Parliament has authorized 35 billion to the CIB and the requisite authorities under our act to participate in innovative financing transactions and complex infrastructure transactions to really try to get more infrastructure built in Canada. Within that 35 billion, Parliament expects and has given us the authority to manage our portfolio such that we're the net fiscal expense of the government of Canada within the $180 billion will not exceed 15 billion. And the reason for that is, as using federal support, the CIB, in order to catalyze more private sector involvement into infrastructure projects, we are trying to put more of our capital at risk and take more chances in respect of particular projects. So it's understood that in some instances, the CIB may not achieve a full return on capital, but that is within the objective of, again, as I said, getting more infrastructure built, more participation from the private sector into projects that are in the public interest and can generate revenue. We're guided by broad government policy. So we have as defined in our priority sectors, 5 priority sectors for investments, which are green infrastructure projects, clean power, public transit, trade and transportation, involving trade corridors, for example, ports, or other types of projects, and broadband infrastructure, which we all recognize that is a necessary good that needs to be achieved. In our most recent statement of priorities and accountabilities from the minister, we have also set a $1 billion target for investment in infrastructure projects for Indigenous communities across each of these 5 priority sectors. Next slide. So our main function are primarily related, as I said earlier, to invest into infrastructure projects that fall within our mandate. But we also have a broader mandate to also provide advisory functions to other governments in helping them define their infrastructure priorities and helping them work on some projects that may meet the objectives and the mandate of the CIB. So in looking at where they are looking in terms of their infrastructure priorities, finding ways where particular projects could receive capital from the private sector and coming up with investment structures that could catalyze more private sector involvement. So we engage in many of these advisory mandates. The biggest example, high profile example of that right now, for example, is we've set up a joint venture and a joint project office with Via Rail Canada to study high frequency rail within the Quebec City, Toronto corridor. So this falls within one of the priority of the federal government, and our mandate there is to provide advice to the federal government as they are looking to make decisions on that particular project and potential procurement models for that particular projects. We also have a research and data information function within our mandate. That involves in large part partnering with other organizations from civil society to provide research and to advance knowledge in respect of infrastructure within our mandate. Next slide. Our corporate plan activities, so as a Crown Corporation, our authorities, again, are in large part informed by priorities of the federal government. And in terms of our legal authorities, they're usually defined in what is called a corporate plan, which is really our business plan, which provides our objectives over a 5-year period. Our most recent corporate plan, in line with the current pandemic, is focused on what we refer to as a growth plan, where we are looking to invest $10 billion over the next 3 years into 5 priority areas within each of our priority sectors. So one of those priority areas involves zero emission buses in terms of accelerating the adoption of zero emission buses across Canada. Clean power and looking at renewables, district energy projects, provincial interties in Canada, which is a huge priority. Larger green infrastructure, which in large part we've announced a major program on building energy retrofits programs within the private and the public sector. A broadband initiative aligned with priorities of the federal government, and trade and transportation, particularly looking at agricultural related infrastructure projects. And within that, to get more projects off the ground, we've also set aside $500 million to contribute to what we refer to as acceleration, early works, and feasibility studies that need to be achieved in order to achieve a critical path towards getting more projects built. Next slide. So this refers to our investment process. which I wanted to highlight because you'll see it will become relevant later on in my presentation as I refer to our KYC processes within the bank. So this slide really shows you in terms of what we refer to as the project process, the funnel of investments as they come in from intake all the way to achieving financial close and the ongoing monitoring of an investment as part of our asset management function. Since inception, so early 2018, I would say, we've received approximately 400 projects through our intake phase. About 189 of those projects were deemed out of mandate, meaning in large part either they weren't tied to one of our priority sectors of investment, they were either too small, they weren't bankable, meaning that there wouldn't be projects that could generate revenue and therefore are more properly suited for the traditional grant process from the federal government. Or there may be projects that, upon initial review, we've determined that are commercially financeable in the private markets without the need of CIB support. So there wasn't any financing gap that was available that needed for us to fill. We've since inception have reached financial close on 2 projects, which are one referred to the Réseau Express Métropolitain, which is a light rail project in the Greater Montreal area, and another project in Alberta, which refers to irrigation of agricultural lands, which was most recently announced in December of last year. I would say in terms of investment structuring and commitment, right now we're actively engaged on close to 20 projects that we are looking to structure an investment and make an announcement, which is quite exciting in terms of number of announcements. And we're also, I would say, formally engaged either in an advisory engagement or a formal memorandum of understanding on another 30 projects or so. When we look at projects, it's not just, I would say, the financial components to it. We are also driven by considering potential impacts that our investments would achieve within our priority sectors, such as reduction of greenhouse gases, improved connectivity across Canada through broadband, shorter commute times, overall economic growth, and more Indigenous participation in the project itself. That's further defined in our investment policy, which you can access on our website. Next slide, please. This is an overview of our projects in terms overall within the project funnel process. Some, as I said, have reached financial close. Others are, I would say, in the MOU stage. You can see from this map overall good coverage from coast to coast in respect of projects that we're actively working on, and also very good coverage within each of our 5 priority sectors. Next slide. So now really making a transition more in terms of governance and accountabilities and the build out of our responsible business policies and procedures. As I said earlier, the CIB is a federal crown corporation, so we are accountable to Parliament through the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities for the operations and our activities. We're guided by priorities of the federal government and by objectives of the federal government, which are usually communicated to us through a statement of priorities and accountabilities. When the bank was first set up with the inaugural board in December, those priorities really set out meeting best practices in terms of governance and accountability, align with best practices in both the public and private sectors. And I can say that, when I first joined the bank, as the first general counsel in November of 2018 and started with a blank sheet of paper, most of my work over the last 2.5 years has been really the standing up and the build out of that particular function. As a federal crown corporation, we're also subject to federal legislation and policies that apply generally to the crown corporations. That includes a Conflict of Interest Act in respect of the members of our board of directors, and we have specific policies in respect of a separate code of conduct for our board of directors, separate conflict of interest policy with respect to our board, and practices in place to align with the Conflict of Interest Act. We're also subject to the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act, which is really sets out the framework for whistleblowing and wrongdoing across the federal public service. And that includes incorporating procedures internally with respect to the receipt of complaints, anti-reprisal provisions, and the disclosure of any wrongdoing following an investigation to the Public Service Integrity Commissioner. We're also subject to the Access to Information Act, the Privacy Act, and adhere to the principles of government, of open and transparent government, and the Values and Ethics Code for the public sector. Next slide, please. So when we look at responsible business conduct in terms of where we are in our process of maturing our processes over the course of the last 2.5, 3 years, I've set out really the framework that we've put in place, and that's really aligned within our code of conduct for employees, which has gone through a significant redraft over the course of the last year and was reapproved by our board in November and is now publicly available on our website. Aligned to that, within our broader sustainability and responsible conduct initiatives, we have a separate conflict of interest policy for employees. We've aligned now our respectful workplace policy with the new amendments to the Canada Labour Code that came into force on January 1st of this year. We have spent a lot of work over the course of the year in terms of maturing our processes in respect of procurement, anti-money laundering, which I will speak to in this presentation more broadly, and we have a specific disclosure of wrongdoing policy, which is aligned with the principles of the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act I was referring earlier. And our sustainability policy, which is still under development and progress, is really the umbrella that will tie this all together and discuss how we integrate this. Next slide. So our code of conduct, as I said, it's gone through a significant redraft meant to align our code with what we refer to as our core values, and there's 5 of them, which are integrity, accountability, respect, inclusion, and leadership. And it's also been reformatted to provide clearer guidance to staff and very clear expectations in terms of what we refer to as the 7 guidelines of ethical conduct, which includes compliance with laws and regulations. All staff, upon joining the organization, are required to do a training session with me on the code, sign in an acknowledgement, and we renew these acknowledgements on an annual basis, and I provide quarterly reports on compliance with the code to our board of directors through our governance committee. Next slide. So AML, I would say, in terms of where we are right now, we are making a transition, I would say, from what I would refer to as the standing up of the function to what I would refer now as operational hardening of our policies and procedures, and the learnings that we have in place as we are now involved in more transactions and are undertaking our processes within that policy, particularly in terms of our due diligence processes for KYC. So the way that we've set up our governance framework, we have an overarching policy, which is approved by our board of directors, that outlines our commitment, outlines the fact that we will seek to be aligned with best practices, and compliant with Canadian laws and regulations in respect of this. And then is then, in terms of the details, referred to as what we refer to as our KYC due diligence procedure, which is our procedure on knowing our clients, identifying our clients, and verifying the identity of our counterparties. Within our procedures, there's what we would refer to as, I would say, 3 gates for a KYC check. Those are usually set out in terms of an intake of a project, particularly if we receive an unsolicited proposal in respect of particular parties. The second gate would be what we refer to as the formal engagement stage. So really prior to making a public announcement in respect of a project in the form of a memorandum of understanding or another formal advisory engagement, once we know the parties that we're dealing with. And then in respect of the investment structuring and the commitment phase, once we've had an idea in terms of who are all the counterparties involved, once we've sought more private sector investment into a particular project before reaching financial close, that would also be a condition precedent of our financing in terms of completing the KYC check. There's also enhanced due diligence procedures that we have in place, ongoing monitoring. Right now we have a practice where we do an annual review of all of our investments, and that includes a refresh of any changes of KYCs that may have happened as part of that annual review. Next slide. Here, as well as Susan mentioned earlier, this is really meant to cover some of the industry risk and the red flags for large infrastructure projects that we are aware of and that we communicate to staff as part of our ongoing training and awareness in terms of that. This may be covered as part of the open discussion that we'll be having later on, but we are involved with many PEPs as part of our KYC processes. The reason for that is the projects that we are working with in terms of our counterparties are mainly public sector sponsors or have the support of a public sector sponsor. And as sort of we've talked about previously, I mean, Canada is a small country in respect of that. So there's been a lot of hardening, I would say, in terms of our procedures over the past year in our clearance of domestic PEPs in respect of that, and it's highlighted as one of our risk areas. And other risk areas in terms of work that has been done and completed, and apologies for the typo in terms of the task force for P3 infrastructure projects, is also the recognition as part of our processes, mainly in terms of how we negotiate our rights for information and our audit rights in respect of projects. In respect of that, in looking at due diligence and ongoing monitoring of particular projects. So I think this was my last slide. I may have gone a little over my 12 minutes, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. There is a question from a participant, but I think I'm going to put it on ice. I think it's directed to you, but I'll put it on ice for now because I'd like to move over to Nick for his presentation. And I just want to remind everybody to be mindful of the time during your presentations, because I would really like to leave a bit of time for Q&A and some discussion after the presentations are done. So Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Indeed, I will try to be then fairly brief and give time for questions. I suppose you've just heard from somewhat the new kid on the block. I suppose that puts us rather as the old timer when it comes to MDBs. As was mentioned by Susan, the bank has been around since 1958. And if we go to the next slide, then you'll see, I think, a presentation of some of the key elements sorry, I'm just having a little trouble getting the video on for some reason. I don't know if the organizers can help me there. I can assure them that I have clicked on the start video more than once. But I suggest I continue, and perhaps we'll get that sorted out at some point during the course of the presentation. So the European Investment Bank is, as was said, the largest multilateral lender in the world. It is owned, in fact, by the 27 member states of the European Union, and has therefore, as its board of governors, the individual finance ministers of those 27 countries. Just perhaps to give you an order of magnitude in terms of size, we have a balance sheet of around about 600 billion, so a little over $500 billion. We make a profit of close to 2 billion per annum. And traditionally, we have been very much involved, indeed, as was presented in the previous presentation, in the infrastructure space. We're headquartered in Luxembourg, in this building that you can see part of. And in fact, this building, which was built about 10 or 15 years ago, actually was designed very much at the time with a view to transparency, which is why you see all the glass everywhere. It was really intended to give a direction and orientation in terms of strategy. Today, we lend approximately a third of our lending to the private sector, around about a third to the public sector, and finally a third to financial institutions, who then on-lend those funds to small businesses. We do both debt as well as equity, and over time, we've progressed very much more from, if you like, plain vanilla public sector lending towards financial engineering, structured products, including things like asset-backed securities and risk-sharing facilities more generally. If we could move on to the next slide, then here, just to give again a bit more information regarding the bank. Our capital is subscribed by the member states, but we raise around about 60 to 7 billion euros of funds on the capital markets every year. What this means is that it's absolutely vital that we retain our AAA rating. So this is the highest rating, of course, by the rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. We have a AAA rating from all three, and it's really fundamental to the bank's business model. We borrow cheap, and we intend to therefore lend at very favorable conditions. Of course, it's not just about lending at favorable conditions, however, it's also very much about providing a broader value added to our clients, which goes beyond pure financial value added, but also to provide them with advice and technical input. We lend around about 65 billion per annum, as I said, across the public, private, and financial space. Around about 90% of this lending is actually within the European Union. Of course, that still means that we provide a considerable amount of finance outside the European Union, in the order of about 7 billion per annum, which is, I think, quite large when you compare with any standalone development institution. And our priorities, as you can see on the slide, are innovation, environment, infrastructure, and small and medium-sized enterprises. Of course, when we lend outside the European Union, we also go to some fairly, I'd say, exotic countries. And this, of course, poses a number of challenges with respect to compliance-related activities. In total, we're about 3,500 staff. And as you'll see on a subsequent slide, this means that indeed we're quite a number of people who are involved in, I would say, the compliance-related activities generally. If we could move then to the next slide. As you can see here, we very much believe that it's important that we act as a responsible institution. And indeed, the bank has a statutory requirement to apply best practice. And this best practice doesn't only apply to what we call here prudential regulations, so capital, liquidity, and the management of financial risks, but it applies equally also to the management of non-financial risks. So the way in which we manage our operational risk, the way in which we manage the bank's reputation, the way in which we manage compliance and conduct risks, and cyber and information security risks. And so it's fundamental, and what we see is that, at least over here in Europe, a much greater emphasis from regulators and banking supervisors on these non-financial risks. If you like, over recent years, I think they've put considerable pressure on financial institutions to manage the balance sheet in terms of capital and liquidity. And essentially, the major banks have got that now. I mean, they're stress tested, they're put under pressure to raise capital and have sufficient liquidity buffers in place. What we see now more and more is an emphasis on these non-financial risks, and bank supervisors looking very carefully at how banks are managing environmental risks, social risks, governance, and more market behavior type risks. And particularly in keeping with the bank's aspiration to be the EU climate bank, and we have committed as an organization that 50% of our lending activity will be to climate related projects by 2025, and that all of our lending will be Paris aligned. We therefore have in place quite a number of policies and procedures to ensure that we uphold the highest standards in terms of ESG, and increasingly what we see also is a requirement to go further in a number of areas, such as in relation to human rights, which is something that we see more and more emphasis on from civil society, and unfortunately. Globally, more and more issues related to human rights concerns. If we could look then at the next slide, and again, I apologize. It seems that the video function does still not work. I don't know if it's something to do with the transatlantic nature of the conference. We worked when we tested it, but anyway, I continue. Just to give you an idea of how we are set up, and perhaps also that with size also comes, a degree of complexity. There are three main areas of the bank that are involved in this space. We have an Inspectorate General function, as you can see on the slide. They are responsible for investigations. Into fraud or into misconduct, for example. We have a complaints function, as you would expect, and importantly also we have an evaluation function that carries out ex post evaluations of our operations in specific sectors or with specific types of clients, and this provides important lessons learned for the organization. There is then the Office of the Chief Compliance Officer, which is the function that I head up. The remit of this function is largely defined by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision's definition of compliance risk. And my main responsibilities therefore cover AML CFT, and some of the issues that obviously Frédéric was outlining in the previous presentation. We have also quite an extensive sanctions compliance framework, and more what we see is a need to align ourselves with best practice in other areas, such as in relation to market abuse. Concerns or risks related to issues such as insider trading, market manipulation. As I said, we borrow extensively. We have, for example, a derivatives book of about 800 billion. And therefore, it's important that we ensure that staff are not misusing information that they have at the disposal. Final point here, perhaps, is one issue that also, again, with size, I would say, comes scrutiny, and more we see an emphasis on conduct, and particularly conduct of members of our governing bodies. So close attention to potential conflicts of interest, to issues of so-called revolving doors, as members of our governing bodies come into the organization and go out of the organization. Final actor here is our projects directorate, which, as you can see, is quite large. These are our engineers and economists who look at specific operations that the bank is financing, and they're the ones that carry out the AE, the economic, social, environmental, and human rights due diligence specifically. So moving on to the next slide, I will be very, very brief. Time is running short. If we may move on. You have on the next slide just an overview of the key policies. Happy to answer any questions in relation to these. I think just a key point here is that even when all of this is in place, it evolves all of the time. We're seeing really rapid development, certainly in the EU, of the legislative environment, and as I said, a much greater attention of regulators and supervisors to non-financial risks. And so the hurdles are being set ever higher, and obviously this imposes quite some considerable challenges for the organization. Which brings me to the last slide, which is I think what I called the hot topics, and what are we focused on these days. In the AML CFT space in particular, it's very much about aligning with the so-called 3 lines of defense model, which is considered best practice within financial institutions, and particularly ensuring that the first line of defense, those are the officers who are actually facing clients, have the skills and the competencies to be able to carry out risk assessment, be it with respect to financial or non-financial risks. Very much a second concern is systems and data. I mean, with 50+ years of history, we have, like I think many organizations, quite some challenges in terms of our in terms of digitalization and process improvement, and particularly also around data quality. What we see in compliance is that these things become more and more critical. A greater need to be able to mine our data, to analyze our data, to track the very considerable flows of money that are going in and out of the organization, and ensure that we're not dealing with any counterparts who may be sanctioned or on any other kind of adverse media type lists. Second area is around market abuse. I mentioned this briefly. We are in the process currently of updating all of our market abuse guidelines, our conflict of interest guidelines. We have operations where we have an equity tranche, a debt tranche. We may be using our own money. We may be using money from the European Commission, and all of these different roles and responsibilities mean that we have to ensure that we have appropriate Chinese walls in place, and that as the second line, that we are actually checking that the Chinese walls are effective within the first line of defense. Third point is governance reforms. As I said, increased scrutiny from our key stakeholders, and so we are updating, I would say, on a biannual basis, our codes of conduct, our whistleblowing policy, and investing quite heavily also in training and awareness building amongst our staff, and also our governing bodies. We're also focusing very much on reinforcing the group dimension. The bank has a subsidiary which deals specifically with equity funds and securitizations, and we are looking these days at potentially the creation of a development bank subsidiary. And we want to make sure that we operate as a group and not as a series of individual entities. And finally, we shouldn't forget that there's a business to run, and there's a crisis, of course, going on, and the bank has been requested to support the EU response with a 25 billion guarantee facility, which translates into around about 200 billion of lending activity. We have to roll this out in a period of 18 months, whilst obviously trying to ensure that we remain very much true to our climate ambitions. So I would leave it there. I hope I'm more or less on time, and again, I very much apologize for the lack of any video, but
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick. Did you try, silly question, but pressing on your start video button yourself? Because we don't have control of your video. So.
Very many times. It was flashing up and I was prompted, but it didn't make any difference, I'm afraid. Huh?
Oh, sorry about that. Look, there's a quick question of clarification, which I think I'll ask you now, and then we can move on to Pascal. Somebody, a participant, asked whether there was any collaboration or cooperation between the EIB and the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Are you connected in any way, or do you work together in any way?
Yeah, we work a lot together. I mean, the EIB is a shareholder of the EBRD, and in fact, the EIB director on the board of the EBRD is the former head of compliance. So we work very closely with them, but even more broadly, we are constantly trying to ensure that we align our procedures where we can, so that for a client that might seek financing from both entities, we don't ask them to run through two sets of procedures which are similar but not the same. It's a bit more tricky in certain areas of compliance because we are bound by EU directives and regulations, whereas the EBRD is not formally bound by those same regulations because, of course, it has a mixed shareholding. It's not only EU shareholders, but it includes others such as the US, Russia, etc. So it's not fully aligned, but indeed we work quite closely.
I see. Thank you for that. Pascal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, Susan will give a bird's eye view as somebody who's been on the enforcement side and also somebody who's been teaching international anti-corruption. And so because of my work in a multilateral development bank and my teaching, I've been able to observe corruption all over the world for many years. So when preparing these remarks, I've also had in mind the many real fraud and corruption and collusion cases I've seen over the years. So with infrastructure, if it goes well, look at the slide, you get a lovely bridge, a road, a rail. As you can see, I've taken very nice pictures because I figured, all of us can't travel these days, so it's good to look at photographs. Next slide. If it goes badly in infrastructure, this is the type of thing that we see, collapsed dam, bridge, and road. Next slide. So the thing is, with infrastructure, you can often clearly see whether it's good or it's bad, right? On the left-hand side is a road in Afghanistan. Right-hand side is a road in Morocco. Next slide. So bad results in infrastructure can be caused by a number of causes. It can be poor planning, coordination, execution. It can be a lack of financing, it often happens. It can also be weather, force majeure. But today we're speaking about one of the things that can also go wrong, and that is corruption. When there's corruption involved in infrastructure, there's often delays. The cost goes up as well significantly because no company is paying the bribes out of their own pocket. If they're paying bribes, if a company pays bribes to government officials, that money needs to come from somewhere, right? And so so for instance, in roads project, the quality, the density, the surfacing of the road will be less thick than necessary. And that will cause the road to deteriorate more quickly. So corruption directly goes towards the quality of infrastructure projects. Corruption in infrastructure also hurts competition, right? It hurts the leveling of the playing field. We've already spoken about the quality. And then the other thing that it does is it undermines trust in the government. And trust in government is something that has been going down for years. And so next slide. I want to show you here a recent study that came out. According to the 2020 Pew Research study, only 20% of Americans say that they trust the government to mostly do the right thing. And this, the trust in government numbers is something, like I said, has been going steadily down over the years. Next slide. I also want to show you the Edelman Trust Barometer. People that work on corruption, this is something that we follow from year to year. And it was interesting last year when the pandemic just started, maybe because people really wanted to believe in their government. They wanted to believe that the government was going to get things right. Trust in government went up drastically, and then as soon as people thought, well, maybe things aren't going as much as we liked it, things went drastically down. And so, for instance, Canada went down 11 points. Next slide. Now here is something interesting. So the Edelman Trust Barometer looks at the trust that people have in governments, in media, and in NGOs, and as well as in business. So look at this slide. Less competent to the left, more competent to the right, ethical and unethical up and down. And what was interesting is that business actually, for the first time ever, was on the side of both being viewed, because this is perception, right? Being viewed as more competent and more ethical than anybody else. Government, as you can see, is like, way on the left. So this is interesting, and I hope that this is good news for infrastructure projects. Next slide. So here I want to tell you a joke. So every country in the world has a joke about a bridge. When I tell people that I work on anti-corruption, invariably, people are going to tell me a version of the following. A senator invites a governor to his home. He shows the governor his Rolls Royce, and he says, isn't my car beautiful? And the governor says, it is. And the senator says, do you want to know how I could afford to buy it? Look out of the window. See that bridge over there? 5% of its building funds, went into my pockets. The governor says, So a few weeks later, the governor invites the senator to his home for a party. The senator gets there, and I mean, that house is a palace. I mean, the most amazing house, he's ever seen. And so he goes, senator goes to the governor and says, where'd you get this money to buy all of this from? And the governor takes him outside, and he, points to the horizon, and he says, see that bridge there? And the senator says, what bridge? So what's interesting about this story is that I've now heard this, right, from people all over the world. I heard this from Belgians, I've heard this from Latins, Africans, Asia. Jokes often reflect the preoccupations of citizens. And so the fact that infrastructure is prone to corruption is not going unnoticed. Next. So corruption can happen at any stage of the investment cycle. So it can happen at the stage of the needs assessment. Is it really necessary to build this road, to build this bridge? We've all heard about, these white elephant projects, giant infrastructure projects that are not even needed and cost a lot of money. Corruption can also happen at the time that the companies get selected, bribes paid to government officials. And it can also happen during the implementation, for instance, by bribing supervising engineers. I've seen several of those cases, and maintenance. And this is what I would call the double loss issue. So research has shown that funds that should go for new infrastructure, so it's been earmarked for new infrastructure, in fact, those funds go to maintenance. And so this is, maintenance of the infrastructure that was badly built because of the corruption. So this is really a double loss issue. Next slide. Now, integrity measures can be applied throughout the public infrastructure cycle because corruption can happen throughout, all these different phases. So first thing is obviously a standard of conduct, ethics codes for all actors in the infrastructure process. So both on the side of the private sector and on the side of the government. What's important there is that these codes of conduct must be easily accessible and they must be published because then it shows that the entity is willing to be held accountable. Other integrity measures are conflict of interest rules, safeguarding the confidential info. So having systems whereby it's prevented that the government officials sell or quid pro quo, exchange for bribes, confidential information about upcoming or existing infrastructure projects. Public consultations, very important. Lobbying rules. Next. It's also important to know who you deal with. Next. Because as we know, the company described in the investment proposal, next, may not always be the company that actually is shown in the due diligence. So this is, I thought this was a marvelous way of showing the distinct advantages of doing due diligence. Next. Back to those integrity measures that can be applied throughout the public infrastructure cycle. So first of all, whistleblower hotlines, other reporting mechanisms, very important, and they must be done properly. So they must be widely advertised. They must be easy to use, and they must also provide retaliation protection. So whistleblower protection and a complaint mechanism is something that is, you know, very, very popular these days because it is very necessary. But it must be done correctly, right? I remember one day in a faraway country, I was at the customs and just shown my passport, and then below the desk of the customs official there was a little box. If you have complaints or if you were asked for corruption, you know, you can put your complaint in here. I mean, nobody in his right mind in front of a government official that is going to let you in or out of the country, right, is going to like write down the complaint or just been asked for a bribe, you know, and put it in the box. So maybe instead of the box, you can have an anonymous way of doing it via the internet. So the way that it's actually done in practice is very important. Transparency, open data. I mean, things are so much better now that, you know, one can use technologies such as, you know, e-procurement, transparent budget processes, so that the citizens know, you know, how much money there is, where it's going to go to. So, and that brings it to the involvement of civil society and the citizen monitoring, both for the cost and for the progress. There, one starts seeing really wonderful new ways of making sure that infrastructure projects, you know, are going well. For instance, you know, simply with asking people, the citizens, you know, to take a photo of how much road, you know, has been built, and with geo-monitoring, this is something that can be done. So, last thing I want to mention is internal controls. Very important, and also external audits at any stage of the project. I want to give some final observations. Next slide. And that is, you also always need prevention, and then you need consequences. You need remediation. So one needs to look at what can be done to prevent the corruption, but also at what are the consequences? What is the remediation once you bump into something that is inevitable, that you're going to bump into something? So for instance, do you have the right to audit? What other recourses are you going to have? Can you get out of the contract? Can you ask the contractor to fix things? So again, it's all in the details. Next, I would want to mention that looking at it from, you know, an outside observer, it's important to have a match between what you expect inside, what you do inside an organization, and what you expect from the outside, the third parties that you do business with. Thirdly, next, no, you can keep the slide, but the third point that I want to mention, that in the end, it's all about the mindset. And what I mean with that is that does one put in place a program because one has to? Or does one put in place a program because one wants to? The implementation of any type of integrity program will be very different depending on the answer to this question. You can have a system where your starting point is to ensure that you do everything correctly, or you can have a system where you do everything so that you try not getting caught for something wrong. So again, the difference in philosophy will lead to very different outcomes in practice. So another way of putting it is avoiding being caught is not the same as avoiding bribery. And this in practice, one sees that over and over again. So also want to mention benchmarking and influence from national law. So our two speakers have mentioned this, is that it'd be interesting to see how infrastructure banks are going to evolve in the future, because any development bank, any organization, rarely makes something up from scratch, right? You're going to go and benchmark, you're going to go and look what the other people are doing. And then what happens, for instance, in the national context will determine what development banks or infrastructure banks are going to do. So for instance, there is a big focus on data, like the US Department of Justice in the FCPA context has been pushing not only having data, but also making that data available to the compliance people. So if you see something like this being pushed at the level of the Department of Justice, be it in the FCPA context, but that's the type of thing that then, over the years or over time, because it's actually go faster, will influence how infrastructure banks are doing work. I also want to mention the pandemic. So the thing that I'm seeing and that I'm hearing is that once the pandemic is over, given that a lot of companies have lost money, it's unfortunately expected that some company may start cutting corners. At the same time, the public mood, because people have lost loved ones, and also economically, they're not doing very well. So the public mood may very much be against corruption. So I expect there to be some backlash before long in terms of an increased enforcement. And because the public is not going to be happy, and they will want to show that action is being taken. So last point I want to make, leave it on a positive note. In infrastructure, especially big infrastructure projects, sometimes there are very few players. And so if you have very few players, meaning companies that can actually do the work, that can be a disadvantage because it's easier to collude when there's fewer players. But it can also be an advantage because if it's a small group of players, it's arguably easier to clean up that small pool of players. And so over the years, one sees, initiatives such as integrity pacts, and another one is a high-level reporting mechanism, which is something that's been promoted by the OECD and the Basel Institute, which has been used in Argentina and Colombia. It's a very practical thing. It just means it's an office being set up, say, the prime minister's in the prime minister's office, where in real time companies can go and they can complain and they can say like, hey, I was just asked, for a bribe, stop this business, so as to level the playing field. So there's a lot out there. I'll stop there and I look forward to the Q&A. And thank you very much for having me being part of this panel.
Thank you so much, Pascal. Very, very engaging presentation. We're going to move on to the Q&A now, and there's a few questions from participants that have streamed in, and I have a couple of questions for the panelists as well, but there's a question of clarification for Frédéric. Somebody asked, how different is CIB to the wound down PPP Canada? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. So PPP Canada was established about 10 years ago with, I would say, a mandate similar to this current construct that we have in the CIB, but was mainly limited to advancing public-private partnerships in Canada in accordance with the PPP model that we've developed in Canada over the last 15, 20 years that overall has been incredibly successful. But the mandate of PPP Canada was very targeted and limited to that type of procurement and financing structure for projects. The CIB's mandate is much broader than that. We call ourselves agnostic to any model of investment structure or procurement model. We will look at projects that probably fall within the more traditional public-private partnership that we're used to, but our mandate to invest is much larger than that, and would include projects that are not within a PPP model, would include financing structures that aren't necessarily purely project finance. Financing structures could include more corporate finance type of financing structures in respect of our projects. So it's, I would say the mandate of the CIB is really broadening the toolkit in terms of using public money in partnering with private sector investors in respect of a broader model of infrastructure projects that can be built.
Thanks. I have a question for both Frédéric and Nick, actually, and you obviously alluded to, risk areas in your presentations, but I'm curious to know what keeps you up at night. I mean, you're both very different organizations with different risk profiles. Frédéric, you're operating in Canada, which is not a endemically corrupt country. I'm just interested in what your concerns are. And Nick, from your perspective, what is your main worry for EIB? So Nick, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. I hope you can hear me and maybe even see me. I've changed device.
I can see you, fantastic. Why don't we start with you,
Okay.
Nick, and we'll go to Frédéric.
Sure. I mean, I think that what if you like, what keeps me up at night is you can handle the things that are knowns, if you like. I mean, what is very difficult is the unknowns. And I mean, certainly, as an institution like ours, I mean, we do very much sort of live and die on reputation. And so it only takes one, significant scandal or something like that to put very significant pressure on the organization. I think, in my 20 years of experience in organizations like the EIB, I think it's fair to say that politicians tend to be making changes is probably something that they put less emphasis on than avoiding any bad publicity. And so you might do 9 things right and get one wrong. And that will play out very badly in the press. So I suppose from my side of things, it is really the single incident that we may get particularly in some of the very difficult countries. It's easy with hindsight, but if you're operating in countries like Mali, Mozambique, Madagascar, Somalia, Rwanda, which are some of the countries that we operate in. Where it's very difficult to draw the line between what you should do as a public institution with a policy mandate. The EU wants to support these countries. We as the EU bank should support those countries. But we know that, corruption is rife. There are very politically exposed people. How do we put in place the necessary mitigants that we don't cross that line between acceptable risk and unacceptable risk? And that's the biggest challenge, I think, for us. Thanks,
Frédéric.
What keeps me up at night? Same. The CIB, our biggest risk is reputational. And for me, it's making sure that we have solid foundations in place in order not just execute our mandate in terms of meeting the objectives of government, but having a strong foundation within the CIB itself. One statistic in terms of how this can get complicated in terms of what we're dealing with the pandemic is if we look at the growth of the CIB, we've almost doubled since a year ago. And this growth was all driven in a virtual world that we're involved in right now. So staff were coming into the organization and have never stepped foot in the office. And how from a compliance function, are you making sure that these values, as I spoke to earlier, are being clearly communicated to staff, that there's the right tone at the top and that is being lived through across the organization. If we look at more in terms of our mandate, I mean, things that keep me up at night is, again, in terms of setting the right foundations in terms of our project documentation, which I mean, all of this is new, in terms of, are we having the right regard in terms of our project? Is our due diligence in respect of these projects mature to the point where it should be? Are we undertaking projects with following our processes? So mean, those of you in Canada, and you know, this is all public. I mean, the biggest criticism of the CIB is that it hasn't done much in 3 years. Well, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day, and we're looking at large-scale infrastructure projects, which in large part sometimes takes years to develop from the idea to the development to where a project is being able to finance. So in terms of, you know, accelerating that pace, which we want to do, we want to at least prove the model that you know, we want to be successful, but we don't want to do it in a way that is so fast that we're not following our foundations and our processes that are in place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, bearing in mind that all of this, as Nick said, is it's a continuous process, right? It's not one and done. You have to keep working on it as you go along. Pascal, you alluded to the lack of trust and the Edelman barometer and all of that. These infrastructure banks, I think, you know, use contracting models that can be quite complex, and that is potentially, I think it's hard to instill trust when structures are complex, et cetera. What is your view on how, I mean, you alluded obviously in your presentation to that, but what would be the sort of basic recommendations you would have for ensuring that these processes and these contracts, these infrastructure projects instill confidence, as opposed to being seen as, oh, you know, there'll be corruption happening there?
So I did mention the involvement of civil society, and I think there, I was going to say more so, but civil society is important in all environments, right? But if you have a country where civil society, where you have consultations with civil society during the phase of, you know, do we even need this project, right? And you have a vibrant civil society and a vibrant, you know, press, I think that the worst, you know, white elephant projects might be avoided. And then also transparency throughout the project, right? Who gets the, first of all, opening, you know, having e-procurement, making sure that everybody has the right to apply, put in a bid for the contract, and having a lot of transparency around that whole bidding process, making sure that everybody knows who actually got the contract, having in place ways for bid protests. And so each time, you know, you try and prevent, but you also must have a consequence when something bad happens. You must have a remedy. And then throughout, I think the implementation, you know, when the bridge is being built, the road is being built, involving civil society, you know, which basically means the real citizens, the people that in the end are the recipients of the goods and services provided by the government. If you involve them in supervising the project or the implementation of the project, I think, you know, one just gets much better results. So I think transparency, a lot more transparency, and involvement of all the stakeholders involved is probably what is going to get the best result, no matter what type of contracts are being used, right? At the end of the day, a contract is merely a way of, you know, writing down what has been agreed upon amongst people. Right?
Yeah, thanks. There's another question here for Nick about the fact that some EU countries have embraced China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the question is whether there's any impact on the work of the EIB with respect to that.
Well, China, that's a delicate subject, I think, for anybody. Indeed, the EIB has signed an MOU together with a number of other IFIs in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative, and the bank has supported projects which would fit within the Belt and Road Initiative. That being said, you know, it's not, we do not proactively go out to support BRI projects, and indeed, I believe, if I remember well, there's not actually a definitive list of Belt and Road Initiative projects, even if one can surmise what they are based on different lists that do exist. I think at this point, the only other thing I would say is that the bank is to a large extent what would call a policy taker. In other words, it's the European Commission's role to set the policy agenda for how the European Union wishes to cooperate with China. It's not really it's not the bank that determines to what extent the EU should be collaborating with China. So we do follow the lead of the European Commission. That means, as I said, that we are supportive of certain projects that fit into the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's also fair to say that a number of those projects do pose significant challenges for the bank, if I can put it that way, in terms of transparency, in terms of human rights, and as I speak, indeed, we will have a discussion in our board on China during the course of April. So this is very much a moving and developing and delicate subject, I think, where we do not see indeed a unanimous position also between member states. I mean, different EU member states have different positions vis-a-vis China, which complexifies the issue.
Right. Yes, it is a bit of a complicated question, but I thought I'd pass it on. Frédéric, there's a question from actually Roy Cullen, who is was involved with GOPAC, the Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. And the question is about cost benchmarking and whether you see that as useful. And Roy Mr. Cullen mentions that it's cost benchmarking that led to understanding that the costs of infrastructure or road building in Quebec was 20% higher, and it led to the Charbonneau Commission and outing the issues of corruption there. And is that what is your view on that? And is that something that would be within your purview to do, or that you're planning to do?
So wouldn't necessarily be able to comment from a strategic perspective. I mean, this would definitely, when we look at really why the bank was set up in terms of its purpose, as I explained earlier, there's really a tripartite role. We always refer to the investment side of things, but also equally important is the advisory and what we refer to as the data and information aspect to this. So within data and information, yeah, definitely an area I think that can be further explored. We had a board meeting yesterday on one of the investments. The board spent a lot of time on the assumptions of the construction in respect of that particular project, and testing us staff in terms of going back to our independent advisors on the particular costing model of a particular project. So it's definitely an area where we're aware internally. And I think in looking at open data, to what Pascal was saying earlier, there's definitely a lot of areas that are worth exploring in providing open and transparent data in respect of projects for completion and life cycles, right, of infrastructure projects in operation and maintenance as well.
I guess a sort of a follow-on for me would be, I mean, you talk in your presentation of your code of conduct and the 5 values that you embrace, one of which is integrity. And I was wondering how far down the chain, and maybe Nick can chime in as well from his experience, how far down the chain will you go in imposing your values or making sure that your partners and their partners embrace values that are congruent with yours?
Yeah, so in terms of that development, it's integrated in all of our standard project agreements, and it starts at the beginning when I referred earlier in terms of the project process. when we enter into an advisory engagement with a public sector sponsor or a memorandum of understanding with a private sponsor or a proponent, it's baked into into that agreement in terms of having specific clauses with respect to integrity and corruption, and we include that as an automatic breach of that particular agreement. As we progress throughout the advisory engagement to more of an infrastructure investment commitment and ongoing asset management, that's integrated, I would say, within the project agreements in terms of our legal rights for information, but also in terms of conditions precedent to financial close, in terms of clearing KYC, also condition precedent in some projects in terms of to funding a project, particularly if we're going to have a ramp up for a number of years in terms of our credit facility, for example, and then continuous monitoring. I think as a next step, where we can do better as we, I would say, become more transparent and open about our practices, is to within the sustainability framework and the policy I was referring earlier, communicating those values down the chain as you refer, and being more transparent in terms of that in our process. That's on my to-do list.
Yeah, which is rather long, I'm sure. I want to give Nick maybe that. Did you want to chime in, Nick?
Well, I was just going to add that I think it's an interesting question, because in our case, it's really about how far down the supply chain you go. Whilst I think, as Frederic was saying, we have the relevant integrity clauses, etc., in our contracts with our counterparts, and as a result of that, I think we have quite a degree of comfort in terms of the main contractors on the infrastructure financing. And even when we go through intermediary financial institutions to ultimate beneficiaries, smaller businesses, again, we impose these contractual commitments that are cascaded down. But the real question is then how far do you go to the subcontractors? And I mean, in our case, indeed, we require integrity documents, or what's the word? I speak a lot of French here as well. Some sort of attestation, a sort of confirmation, an integrity declaration, I suppose is the word. We require those from our contractors as part of the procurement process, but we're not yet going further down the supply chain. And I think that is again somewhere it's again particularly, I mean, tying that to what I said about human rights. We're coming under not only coming under pressure, but we want to see how far practically we can go down that supply chain to ensure that the integrity issues are well managed.
Yeah. I'm afraid we only have 3 minutes left. I think we've only scratched the surface, but I want to, before I hand the mic over to James Cohen, who's going to do a bit of a wrap up and say some parting words, I really do want to thank Frederic, Nick, and Pascal for participating today. I think it was a really interesting discussion. I think we want to hear more about CIB and how it progresses. And thanks again to all of you and to the organizers for this webinar, which I hope was interesting for all of you. And I'm going to hand it over to James Cohen now, the ED of Transparency International, to say a few parting words.
Great, thank you very much, Susan, and thank you very much to our panelists today for an excellent, really engaging presentation. Susan, as always, for excellent moderation of the panel, and our partners within the anti-corruption law program at the UBC Allard School and iClear and the Business Law School. Always great to partner with all of you. Just as a departing message from Transparency International Canada, if you would like to be involved in TI Canada, you can always become a member. I'm going to put a link up here in the chat box to become a member of TI Canada. If you're one for less paperwork and you like what we do, but just want to make a straight donation, you can always go to our donate page and do that and get your automatic tax receipt from Canada Helps. Or if your organization is interested in becoming an organizational supporter, you can sign up to be an organizational supporter here. Read all the details on all three options to support TI Canada's work and engage with us further. And if you have any further questions, you can always contact me at ti-can@transparencycanada.ca or james.cohen, C-O-H-E-N, @transparencycanada.ca. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope everyone has a great day.